everybody. So we're going to go ahead and work on some Module 6 stuff. And we're going to be talking about work and family. So we're going to start with family and then get into work. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And let's just talk about some definitions real quick. So there's several different kinds of kinship systems. So there's the patrilineal, which essentially is traced through the male line or male ancestry. Matrilineal, which is traced through the female line and or emphasizes the female ancestry. Bilateral, which is technically what we exist in the US. However, it is a patriarchal bilateral system, and so it still emphasizes the man through his name, through those kinds of things. However, you do trace your ancestry in both directions, which is what bilateral talks about. And then there's unilateral, which is just you're tracing your ancestry through a different way. So monogamy is when a relationship where an individual has only one partner, and that can be whether it's marital, social, or sexual. Polygamy polygamy is a relationship where an individual can or does have multiple partners. Synegamy, which is a group marriage. Polygyny, sorry, it's a weird word with a lot of letters, which is where you have multiple wives, or polyandry, which is where you have multiple husbands to one wife. And there's other forms of this as well. And then you have the nuclear family, which implies a couple residing together with their dependent children, and it can be distinguished from an extended family in which a group of related kin, in addition to parents and children, live together in the same household. So essentially, this is the two parents or however many parents and the offspring, and that's how most families operate in this country. However, that's not the same for all cultures. There's three major factors. There are three major trend lines for family dynamics, and that's that the average family size is decreasing. The age at which women decide to have children is later, and the number of children born to solo mothers and or cohabitating partners is growing, as is the number of children being born to LGBTQ families and or being adopted by LGBTQ families. And you see a lot of that uptick due to the legitimacy of same-sex couples in the adoption process through legal rights to being married. And so that is also in an uptick. 16% of all families in the US are multi-generational. Only half of the adults population is married, and 40 to 50% of all marriages end in divorce. 1/3 of lesbian and 1/5 of gay households include children. And again, this number is having an uptick with the allotted ability to access those things, those particular forms of adoption that require marriage or weren't maybe as inclusive prior to this. Cohabitating couples are also on the rise. We're going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of families, because there's different kinds of families that can be under a single household. You have your nuclear families that we talked about earlier. Usually that's two parental figures and some kind of allotted number of children, and or just the two individuals that decide to be in a long-term relationship and they decide to leave their family homes and live together. You have single or solo parent families, and this can be a wide range of individual people who are the actual solo parent, including single moms, single fathers. These particular parents can also include a grandparent that is singly raising kids, or an aunt that might be singly raising kids, or like what have you. You've got blended families, which are essentially when there are children from previous marriages or one previous marriage, and the couple gets together and those families become a blended family, and they end up residing together once the two adults marry or decide to cohabitate. Families headed by lesbian gay or queer domestic partners. And this can be a wide range of different identity-based romantic partnerships. But they can also have children, or sometimes they don't. They can be multiple adult individuals if they are poly or in those kind of relationships. You have cohabitating couples with children, what are essentially generally in a relationship and or are actively staying in a similar living situation in order to raise children together. We have multi-generational households, which are very typical of certain cultural demographics and or in specific economic circumstances, because it becomes more viable or more feasible to band together economic resources and facilitate caregiving in ways to have maybe grandparents look after kids while parents are working or what have you. It allots for economic and social support. You have chosen families, which are essentially when an LGBTQ plus member is not necessarily as embraced in their own biological family, and so they choose one that is more amenable and more inclusive and more affirming. You can have a chosen and a biological family at the same time. Generally, when you do, the chosen family is who you would choose to live with if you have the choice, but sometimes that's not always the case. You also can have chosen families that are made in non-LGBTQ plus situations where just really close friends like decide to be roommates while they're both raising their kids too, or what have you. Chosen families are just essentially non-kin based families that choose to be around each other and support each other in a very familial way. You have adopted families where either where the children have been adopted by non-biological parents. You have skip generation families, or essentially grandparents or that generation raising their children's children. So you're skipping a generation, but you're having the grandparents and the children in a household. We have non-kin based families that can look like all sorts of things. It can look like you and a bunch of your college roommates all living together for an extended period of time and you guys consider yourself family. It can look like the group from so when I talk about this, I often give the example of the show Friends, right? So like it was a whole bunch of people that were living together, were very close. They were essentially a family. And they operated very much like one. And so that would be another example of a non-kin based family structure. You have multi-family households. So when economic times are hard, you see an uptick of pooling of resources. So maybe two nuclear families getting together and deciding to live in like both sides, like to buy a duplex or something together, or you see a nuclear family and say a roommate or what have you, where essentially these multifamily structures are essentially a way to pool resources and social support again, but it's based on relationships that aren't always kin based. You have polyfamilies where you have several adult parents within different interdynamics, and those can result in very different family structures, but and multiple different varieties of that, but essentially you have more than two, usually parental units or adults in a relationship, and then the children that come out of those relationships within a household together. Other facts that I found really interesting when you're talking about diversity of families within the U.S., 1 in 5 U.S. children speak a language other than English in their household, which is astronomically important when we come down to education and accessibility. So we're going to get really quick into how family intersects with different institutions, social institutions. When we're talking about economics, we're talking about how the work-home labor distribution falls down, and that usually falls down very gendered lanes. And so you're going to see assumptions that gender operates in a heteronormative couple that has kids, with the women doing most of the caregiving work, which we'll talk about again. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get into, and care work specifically, when we get into unpaid labor in the that section. But this can include a lot of things, and I've listed off some of these things in here. But then usually the maid breadwinner is considered to supposedly be under those social gender constructions to be the male head of household. And we'll get into kind of how that operates a little bit more in our next chapter, especially as our economy does not necessarily accommodate a single income household predominantly anymore, even in the middle class, which has led to a distinct difference in how labor becomes unequal. And we'll get into that a little more in the labor section. But women also create the laborers, right? By creating new humans, you're creating people that will eventually go into the workforce or eventually become part of that consumer capitalist system. And so in that, women become a very important part of that capitalist structure because it's something that is assumed, right? It is assumed that more workers will be made. And as more women are choosing to not have as many kids or economically cannot produce as many laborers, we're going to find that that's a kink in the capitalist structure. And we'll have to see in the future how that actually pans out when it comes down to an aging population and not as many young people to fill those roles of the aging population. The family is also a consumptive unit, which just essentially says we buy a lot of crap as a family. Like, you buy food, you're using utilities, you're using everything that you have for your household. You're doing, but you're not like, so as a family, especially those with young kids or kids under the age of working, they're not putting into the labor force, but they're still consuming a large amount of products. And so in that, the family becomes an avenue for advertising and for all different kinds of frameworks driven around consumerism. Poverty has become not just a social issue for young children, but it also becomes a child welfare issue. And you see disproportionately, it is women of color that end up having their kids taken away solely for things due to poverty. So lacking the economic resources has them deemed as not viable as parents, which in and of itself shows how flawed that system is. But it also happens at a very disproportionate rate for women of color, which is again another institutionalized racist idea that, without changing how we frame what poverty is and what and how to help those who are in poverty, we can't really fix that problem. And that's part of what continues to get working on when we talk about social welfare programs. So job flexibility, maternity and paternity leave, this is another way, and we'll get into that a lot in the next chapter. So we're not going to get into that a whole lot here. But it deals again with how economics are tied to the family structure. And then things like the global economy and the bride price, which is essentially, like in other cultures, there are specific amounts that one family will pay the bride's family in order to have that bride marry this. So essentially you're paying for that person with some kind of social or economic privileges. And the bride price has been deemed like it's something of massive international debate. It's something that's been broached at the UN floor. There are certain kinds of bride prices and dowries that are no longer allowed. But it also puts women in a very vulnerable position because they lack autonomy and choice, and they lack the ability to leave a lot of those situations because there is an exchange of economic value that is benefiting her then family, her biological family. So when we talk about states and how the family intersects states and politics, essentially, so the state regulates marriage, it regulates benefits programs, it regulates so much of how we operate as families. It also like we can talk about the prison system and incarceration and how that impacts women, again, disproportionately women of color, and women of lower socioeconomic status, that you're going to see them incarcerated at a larger level, which has massive amounts of impact on the family structure. You're going to see that there's no nationally funded childcare, and that has a lot of long-term consequences for women in the workplace and for the economic stability of families that require more than one income. Immigration policy, travel bans, and sanctuary rules. We're going to get into this a lot with one of the readings that we did, so I'm not going to touch on that here. I'll get into that a little more in that lecture or in that slide. And then the rest of them, we're really going to talk about how they socialize our families and how families are socialized around religion, education, healthcare, military, sports and athletics. All of these things really discuss how we socialize, what the family looks like, and they all help to reinforce that heteronormative two-parent married structure that has been deemed the social norm for families. So when we're talking about families in a social unit, our earliest form of like the family is our earliest form of socialization, and it's often the strongest, and it stays influential in our lives in a lot of ways for the majority of people throughout the entirety of their life. And that's a big deal. It's how we get our first ideas. It's the ideas that we want to push up against. It's the ways in which we learn the world and we see the world. It was the bubble that we were first, essentially the social bubble that we first learned, right? It's where we first experienced gendering. It's all the way down to our reveal parties, all the way down to our the baby decor, the clothing and toys the children are allowed to play with, right? Like we experience gender in the family structure. Often that is the most heavily socially regulated areas in which we learn gender. So power within family, and that's just understood as the ability to access resources and the ability to define the reality of others and or allot them resources or restrict them resources, depending. We see age being a very big factor in where the power dynamics are in families. So once you get to a certain elderly age, you lose your ability to have a lot of autonomy within your family. And while you may have wisdom and may be sought after in some ways, you're also going to lose that ability to be seen as a productive member. And depending on the certain circumstances, young children have this similar dynamics, right? They're not going to be seen as that productive part of that. You're going to be seen as needing a lot of regulation, needing a lot of power, or needing a lot less power. You're going to see a lot of power differentials between men and women. And this is, I mean, just they use marriage and weddings as an example to show the traditional ways in which marriage was really about male power over their wives. And I mean, we got to remember too that it wasn't until 70s or 80s that women could, while they were married, could go get their own separate bank account that their husbands were not signed on to. Right. So it was the last century when we were working on women being able to be property owners, right? So like being in a marriage didn't allot you that. And if you hadn't had a son, you lost everything. If your husband died, you had to remarry because you and your children were then essentially wards of the state, because the ownership and everything that you had was yours husband's, was the male figure of that household. And in that, traditionally, their marriage was more about economic leadership or social movement. Like you were about gaining status. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about flowers and rainbows and Valentine's Day. And that is a very, very recent concept. Um, and it kind of shows even as you look through the wedding process. You're going to look at white wedding dresses as this idea of purity, right? That the woman needs to be pure. You're going to see the father giving away the daughter, right? As like, hey, I'm giving you this thing that was mine. You're and thus the daughter was her father's and is now her husband's as opposed to herself, right? You see a loss of name. Sometimes you see a loss of identity, or individuality, because they become Mrs. such and such, not their own self, right? And this is why you see a lot of uptick about women who are doctors being like, I'm not my last name. I'm a doctor. I'm a human. This is me. I did this. And it's a big deal. You also see women wearing engagement rings, and you don't see men doing the same thing, because again, that concept comes from a period of time where it was an ownership mark essentially for other men, so that they knew that that person was betrothed to someone else. And this power dynamic has gotten to a point where men are still socialized to expect certain privileges and unequal distribution of how the household is run. And you have multiple different ways in which you can have this head you can have this head complement where essentially there's two people that are joined together in marriage, but there's very clearly one head of the household that makes most of the decision, that is making all the decisions. The other person is more compliant to that person, what have you. You have a junior partner, senior partner kind of ideology where you're both partners in the relationship, but one is traditionally supposed to make most of the decision making, whether that be an idea that was formulated in your religion, say like Christianity or what have you. But the other person does have the ability to maybe make some day-to-day decisions, or doesn't have to go to someone to make a decision all the time, in the moment. And then you have equal partnership. Again, this is relatively infrequent because we don't have equal distributions of power in relationships generally in the United States, because that's not something that within our framework of gender norms we have articulated or made a social normative. We also, that when you have sexism and this imbalance in power, it can lead to violence. It leads to interpersonal violence. It leads to toxic relationships. It leads to lack of empowerment. It leads to a lot of very harmful things for women. On the flip side of that, family can be, and for a lot of people, is a place of empowerment. It is the people that support you for the longest and for the majority of your life, if not all of it. It is the people that you turn to. It's the people that support you. It's the people that love you. And so in that, family can also be a place for empowerment. It can also be a place for social well-being. And then real quick, we'll get into mothering, and then I'll stop here for this one. So this messaging for mothering is that this innate biological process, that it's something that should come to you. It's something that you should want. It's something that should be one of your biggest goals in life. It should be, you should have this unconditional love and ability to nurture in every way. And you should just automatically be that caregiver and know what you're doing. And you should be so devoted to this and be able to sacrifice a lot of yourself in order to do this. Your careers, you should sacrifice your body. You should sacrifice so many things in order to become this. And now, like, I am a mother, and that is the role that I value most in my life. It is the thing that I will always be. It's the thing that I have the most pride in, and it's the thing I think that I am the best at. However, there also has to be a balance. And in part of me for mothering in my world is to show my children that I am a human outside of being their mom as well. And that human does things like go do these lectures and be an adult human with friends occasionally, right? That's outside of my framework of mothering, because that's not the only role I am. And I don't want them to ever think that that's the only role that I play in my life, because I want them to grow up into people who don't think that just because they are a mother, they can be nothing else, because I don't think that that's the case. And I don't think that that's something that is said enough. There are three basic types of care needs that children need, and that's basic physical needs, including safety, emotional, cognitive, and recreational needs. So they need shit to do and keep them busy, and they need things to keep them emotionally and cognitively engaged, and then maintaining well-being. So that's just giving them the skills to process and deal with life, right? Motherhood is also a consumption product, right? We have to buy things to be a parent. We have to buy the things we are going to feed our children. We have to buy the things that go on their butts. We have to buy them their clothing. We have to do all of these things, keep a roof over their head. Part of doing that is running those errands, is making all of those things. And that's part of parenting, right? So it becomes part of consumerism. So for mothers that work in the workplace, there's this distinct motherhood penalty that where once you become a mother, there's this assumption that you're not going to give your all to work, that you are divided, that your time is divided, that your brain is divided. And in doing that, you are not going to be the best employee to be promoted. You're not going to be the best employee to um, in any aspect, really. And there's these assumptions. On the flip side, though, what I don't think employers realize is that mothers are very used to having to do a lot of different tasks or having a lot of different, essentially, hats they have to put on. And that can be a really beneficial employee for a lot of workplace environments, because those people are used to having to deal with meltdowns. They're used to having to deal with conflict resolution. They're used to having to deal with problem solving. They're used to have to dealing with a lot of different things happening at once. They're good at prioritizing. A lot of times they're really good at being able to manage a lot of different avenues. And these are valuable skills in the workplace, but we frame mothers as inherently bad employees because they also have other responsibilities. And we don't do the same thing for men, that even if they have kids. There is the social sanction, again, of picking a career over having children, which is a valid choice. That is a choice that every woman should have the option to make. However, it comes with the social sanctions of having individuals and in group place settings negatively draw conclusions about you as a human, or suggest that you're not fulfilling what it is that you were supposed to be doing with your life. And then there's the social guilt of being a mom and having to work, right? There's the social guilt of the time it takes out of your interaction with the kids. That's why I do lectures at this point in the day, right? But there's a real social weight that comes with mothers who are also working, especially we saw a lot of that when it came to mothers who were working from home during COVID, right? Like in the weight and the toll that was taking on them. And then when we talk about motherhood, there's also interracial parenting, where there's this negative connotation or messaging that a white parent can't parent a person of color, or vice versa. We have LGBTQ parenting. So again, this idea that we're going to turn all the kids gay by being parents and queer at the same time, which is kind of insane. But but it is a perpetual myth, right? And it's that way for a reason. It's because there is this assumption that LGBTQ plus persons aren't supposed to be parents, because they may not have done it in a biological way that makes someone else feel comfortable. And then we talked a little bit about incarceration and that impact on parenting. And then class has a large range. And again, we talked about all the ways in which being impoverished can impact your ability to properly be part of your family. So I'm going to get off here. I'll do the articles real quick, and then we'll get into the labor section in the next video. So thanks so much for being a part of it.